Hey guys, and welcome back. So in this tutorial we're going to create the wave spawner. So this is a very exciting tutorial because by the end of this video you'll have a working game that you can play and you can have fun with. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. I'll first of all start by creating an empty game object that I'll call wave spawner. I'll then create and add the wave spawner script. Alright, so the very first thing we need to do is to map how a wave will look like. So to do that, I'm going to create a public class that I'll call wave. So this class will contain 3 variables that we'll be able to tweak for every single wave. So the first one is going to be a public enemy array called enemies. So this variable here will contain all the different enemies that can possibly spawn inside of this wave. The next variable is going to be a public integer called count. This variable will be used to dictate how many enemies will spawn inside of the wave. And lastly, I'll create a public float time between spawns. I will also add the system.serializable so that this wave structure will be able to show up inside of the Unity inspector. Alright, so all we have to add now is a public wave array that I'll call waves. So if you now save this script and go back inside of Unity, you'll now see that we've got this waves array and we could choose a size of 2 for example. You'll now see that we've got 2 separate elements and these are our wave structures. So we now can customize the enemies that will happen in this wave, how many enemies there will be, and the time between each spawn. Awesome. We'll also need 2 more public variables. The first one is going to be a public transform array of spawn points. So this variable will contain all the points that our enemies can possibly spawn from. And finally, we will create a public float variable called time between waves. Now we have to create 3 private variables. The first one is going to be the private wave variable called current wave. So this variable here will store the current wave in the game. We will also create a private int variable called current wave index. And the last one is the private transform variable to have a reference to the player. Alright, awesome. That is all the variables that we need for now. Alright, so now inside of our void start function, I'm going to set the player equal to the game object dot find game object with tag, and we'll pass in the player tag. And then I'll just fetch the transform component on them. Alright, so at the start of our game, we want to start our first wave. So we're going to be using a coroutine, so I'll say start coroutine, and we'll call this one start next wave. And we'll pass in our current wave index. So now let's create that start next wave coroutine. So I'm going to say I enumerator start next wave, and it will take in a integer called index. So simply this coroutine is going to wait for a certain amount of seconds based on how much our time between waves is, and then it will call another coroutine to actually spawn the wave. So to wait for a certain amount of time, we just have to write yield return new wait for seconds, and then we will pass in our time between waves. After that, I will start a new coroutine, and we will call this one spawn wave. And we'll pass also our index inside of it. Right, so let's create that spawn wave enumerator. So I'm going to say enumerator spawn wave. It's also going to take the int index parameter, and the first thing it's going to do is set the current wave variable that we created up here, and we're going to set it equal to the waves array, so that's the array of all waves in the game, and it's going to be the index of index. Next off, we have to create a loop. So I'll say for int I equals 0, I is less than current wave dot count I++. So the code that we're going to put inside of these 2 curly brackets will get run as many times as the count variable value. So if the current wave.count is equal to 5, then this code here will run 5 times. So before we write any more code, we're going to check if the player is equal to null. And if he is equal to null, then we're simply going to say yield break. And this will get out of the coroutine and stop the code. Alright, so if the player is not equal to null, then we want to spawn a new enemy. So the first thing we need to do is to select a random enemy from the currentWave.enemies array. So to do that, I'm going to create an enemy variable. I'll call it random enemy, and it's going to be equal to the currentWave.enemies, and the index is going to be a random number. So to create a random number, I'll use the random.range function, and it's going to be a random number between 0 and the currentWave.enemies.length. Next off, we have to choose a random spawn point. So I'm going to create a transform variable. I'm going to call it random spot, and this one here is going to be equal to spawn points with the index again of random.range between 0 and spawn points.length. Lastly, we'll call the instantiate function, and we're going to instantiate our random enemy at the random spot.position and the random spot dot rotation. Alright, so once we have spawned our new enemy, we're going to wait for the time between summons amount of time. So I'm going to say yield return new wait for seconds, and we will pass in our current wave dot time between spawns. Alright, awesome. This code will let us see if the first wave will spawn in the game. So let's try it out inside of Unity. Alright, so here inside of Unity, I'm going to fill in my variables. So first of all, for the first wave, and I'm going to open up the enemies array, I'm going to set it only to one enemy, and I'll select the melee enemy. There will be 5 enemies in this wave, and with a time of 1 second between them. Then after, I'll fill in the spawn points. So for that, I need to create a couple of empty game objects. So I'm going to create an empty game object and call it spawn point. I'm going to place it outside of the map, and then I'll create a couple of them and just scatter them around our map. Alright, once you've created enough spawn points, you're going to create another empty game object, and you're going to call it spawn point group, and then you're going to select all your spawn points and parent it inside of the spawn point group, just to make things clean inside of the hierarchy. Now select the wave spawner object, and you're going to press the lock sign right up here. This will lock the inspector, so no matter what object we press, the inspector will stay identical. So now we could just select all of our spawn points, and we can drag and drop them onto the spawn points array. Once that's been done, we just now need to choose a time between waves amount, so I'll just choose something like 3 seconds. Alright, so before we press the play button, we have to fix one small thing, because we have put our spawn points outside of the map and outside of the stoppers, and so the enemies will get stopped by the stoppers as well. So we're going to have to remove the collisions between the enemies and the stoppers. Alright, so we have to create a new layer for the stopper. So first of all, I'm going to unlock the inspector, then I'm going to go to layer, add layer, and I'll create a layer for the stopper. Now I'll select all 4 of my stoppers, and I'll add the stopper layer to them. Now I'll go under edit, project settings, physics 2D, and I'll find the intersection between enemies and stopper, and I'll uncheck the collisions. Now if we press the play button, the first wave should spawn correctly. And as you can see guys, it is working perfectly. Alright, so the last thing we have to do is to detect when the wave has ended. In other words, when we have spawned our enemies and when all the enemies in the scene are dead. So let's do that right now. So first of all, we have to detect when the wave has finished spawning. So to do that, I'm going to create a private bool variable called finished spawning. So right after we have instantiated our new enemy, I'm going to check if I is equal to currentWave.count -1. So if our I variable, which is the variable that gets incremented by 1 each time we go through the loop, if that variable there is equal to the currentWave.count -1, and we're adding the -1 because remember arrays are indexed starting at 0. So if this equality is true, then we're going to set finished spawning equal to true. Else we'll set it equal to false. Alright, next off we have to detect when all the enemies in the game have died. So right underneath our coroutine, I'm going to create my void update function. Then I'm going to check if finished spawning is equal to true, and if the game object dot find game objects with tag enemy dot length is equal to 0. So in other words, if we have finished spawning our wave and if there are no more enemies inside of the scene, then we have successfully completed our wave. If we have, I'm first of all going to set finish spawning equal to false because we're going to start a new wave. And then before we start the new wave, we have to check if there is a new wave that exists. So to that, I'm going to say if current wave index +1 is still smaller than the waves dot length. Alright, so if there is still a wave to spawn, I'll increment my current wave index of 1, and then I'll start a new coroutine, and it will be the start new wave coroutine, and I'll pass in my current wave index. Else, which means that there are no more waves to spawn, well, that means that we have finished our game. So for now, I'll just say debug.log to print a message to the console, and I'll say game finished. Alright, so we have finished the code, so let's save our script and test all this out inside of Unity. Alright, so to test it out, I'm just going to set my first wave to have a count of only 2 enemies. And the second wave, I'll give the enemies array a size of 2. I'll choose between the ranged enemy and the summoner. And I'll give it a count of 2 as well, with a time between spawns of 3. Now let's press the play button one last time and test it all out. Alright, so the first wave is starting spawning. We've got these 2 melee enemies. Perfect. And now the wave should be ended, and in 3 seconds the new wave has spawned. Perfect. So we've got our ranged enemy, and there must be a necromancer somewhere. Perfect. Let's kill him, and we get the game finished message inside of the console. So everything is working perfectly. Alright guys, so now have fun creating lots of waves, and you can be proud, you can show this to your friends and family. And yeah, great work guys. I'll see you very soon.